So Labor Day is tomorrow. And I like the Labor Day holiday. Not because it marks the end of summer, not because it marks the start of the school year. I, for one, really don't like to be behind the school buses. Does anybody? And not because I can stop wearing summer whites, and not because of any telethons that historically have been all day on Labor Days. You remember those times. Jerry Lewis telethon, always a good cause. It's because it honors something that I think we can all relate to, and that's the people whose labors over the years and even now have led to the social and the economic achievements that we share and the lives that we're able to lead today. So I want to talk first of all a little bit about the origins of Labor Day. There's some relevance to this. The first Labor Day parade was held in New York City, and that was in 1883. It was not a state or a national holiday back then, but laborers and their families recognized a need to celebrate their efforts and their sacrifices. And so they held this parade, and none of them got paid for that day. But it was important to them. The first state to actually have a Labor Day was the state of Oregon. That was a surprise to me. And that was in 1887. But Labor Day did not become a national holiday till a number of years later. It was 1894. And that followed a great strike, a great labor strike by workers who were associated with the railroad industry and who were associated with the Pullman Company that was a big part of that industry. It was a predominant company, and Mr. Pullman had established his own company town just outside of Chicago. Has anybody ever been there? I visited there a couple of years ago. And when business slowed down, Mr. Pullman decided that he was going to up the rent on the workers who he had lived there, and he laid off a lot of them too. And that created great hardship for them and their families. And there was a lot of anger on the part of workers because of this. And there was a lot of people who weren't directly associated who supported their need and their cause. And about 250,000 people participated in a strike that went on and on until the government stepped in, the federal government. And they stepped in with troops, and they stepped in with marshals, and got things moving again. The strike was ended shortly after that, but over 60 people were injured and over 30 people were killed by our own troops and marshals. Congress voted shortly after that, and 6 days after, President Grover Cleveland signed a law declaring Labor Day. And it was sort of a panacea to the labor movement, and it shored up support among trade unions for the government at the time. Now, my own grandfather, his name was John Baldwin, my mother's father. He was a labor organizer in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And back in the early part of the last century, he had developed a lucrative bread delivery route. He built it up for the business owner that owned the company, and he was paid by commission. And he did very, very well. But the owner decided, because he'd done so well, he took over that route himself. And John had the rug pulled out from under him. And he decided that wasn't going to happen again. So next John got a job in the carpet business. No pun intended. Well, actually, it was a pun intended. He had fire in his belly from that last experience with the bread company owner, and he wasn't going to get the rug pulled out again. So he became involved, not just with his job, but he became involved with the labor union that represented carpet layers and those who made mattresses and upholstery. I have a 98-year-old aunt who was his daughter, Aunt Edna, and she's still alive today, and I was talking with her last week. I said, tell me a little bit about his activities. And she said by the 1920s he had become president of the labor union. And he still worked a full-time job, but nights and the weekends he was involved in doing things like negotiating and taking comments from the laborers, and doing things like that, taking their ideas and taking that negotiating for things like safe conditions and fair wages and reasonable work hours. My aunt recalled incidents that had occurred back in that time in history, such as a factory that was in New Jersey, and it was full of women who worked as seamstresses. And they had been locked in by their employer into the building where they worked so that they wouldn't take breaks. They wouldn't take breaks that were unscheduled, and there weren't too many scheduled breaks. And then the building caught fire, and they couldn't get out, and they all perished. So it was incidents like that that drove the labor movement back then. And organizers like my grandfather risked a lot. They risked being fired, they risked being blacklisted, and jailed even, because of their commitment to laborers in the labor movement. Now things are a lot different today. We have a rise in income equality, and that marked a kind of a decline in the labor movement. And the issues are different too. Today we have national issues like health care and trade policy and immigrant rights and living wage campaigns, things like that. And labor unions and collective bargaining, which was a lot what they were about, weren't really designed for some of these battles. In 1945, over 35% of the workers in this country belonged to a labor union or a trade union. And today it's less than 10%. Things have changed a lot. Little sip here. Now, in my own work over the past 35 years, I've worked as a consultant in safety and environmental management, and it's given me a chance to work with a great many companies and government agencies. And I've been really privileged to talk to and become involved and responsible for interviewing an enormous number of people over these years. And these people have worked in many different areas, and I talked to them about the work that they do, and they did. The people I've spoken to have represented people like miners, and truck drivers, and CEOs, and accountants, and chemists, and biologists, and machinists, and mechanics, nurses, and fire chiefs, and electricians, and nuclear reactor operators, and even shipbuilders. These are people who work in paper mills, and textile mills, assembly lines, and on transmission lines, factories that forge auto parts, and plants that refine crude oil into gasoline, and national laboratories that seek to discover the origins of the universe, and other laboratories that make the fuel for nuclear weapons that could frankly obliterate our little universe. I've been into all of these places, and I've talked with people in all of these places. All of these people make a wage. Some of them make a pretty good wage. But it's just as important, the majority said, you know, they like their job. They like what they do. They were proud of their individual contributions and proud of the contributions that their profession or their trade made. And needless to say, it's really been an interesting career for me. And I'm beginning to wind it down now, that part of my work life, take a little less. But it's given me a fascinating perspective on labor and on work. For example, often when I start up my vehicle, I think of the laborers in a Chicago factory that I visited many times, and I watched some of them at these big forging furnaces, big fiery furnaces, and they would be up there and taking big hunks of steel metal and moving it to another location where it would slide down, and these were red hot. I know the work conditions that they endured because I watched them dodge fireballs, for example, to make these parts for my Ford truck. It went into the flywheel. I watched them make the flywheel for my Ford truck. Another time, I might take a sip of a Gatorade bottle. We all do that, from my sports bottle, you know, the kind that pops up. And I recalled a woman on an assembly line in Indiana. She operated a machine that made these little pop-ups for the bottles, for the sports bottles. And hour after hour, day after day, she sat at this machine, making sure everything worked, and watching it pop thousands and thousands and thousands in an hour. And there was an opportunity, I think, for compassion for the work that she did and the conditions that she bore so that we can take a sip of our Gatorade. And then sometimes I'll open up a glossy magazine, and I appreciate the paper that was milled in Wisconsin by a skilled team of paper machine operators that I watched, as well as the warehouse workers who carefully moved 2-ton huge rolls of paper from one room to another. And I recall one who had, the year before I visited, lost his arm doing that work. And then the truck drivers who carted that paper over 1,000 miles to a printing press in Pennsylvania to make that magazine. And when I visit my friend in the hospital, I see the tubes delivering life-saving meds into his body. I sometimes think of the non-obvious, the technician, for example, who calibrates that precise dosing equipment. He can't miss a detail. Got to get it right. And the hospital pharmacist who worked nights to compound those meds and ensure that they were available in the morning. And then when I see a coal-fired power plant, I recall my visit into a coal mine many years ago. It's about 1,000 feet. I went down, and I was only going to be down there for maybe 3 or 4 hours. That's about how long I was down, less than half a day. And I remember blowing out of my nose the remnants of coal dust for over 2 days after that. And I thought about how those workers, and I'd still think about how those workers day after day, year after year, and that's today, that's not 50 years ago or 25 years ago. So you get the picture. We humans have created a really elaborate civilization in which we depend on each other to perform labors. But usually our labors are invisible to each other, aren't they? Until the water becomes contaminated, or the electricity stops, or the delivery's not on time, or the levee breaks, or there's no one available to move the tree that fell on my house, or the emergency medical technicians are so swamped that they can't get to me on time. It's an event like Hurricane Harvey that gives us great reminders of all of those things. And as we watch people in their labors helping others then, that's in our face, and we think about these things. So I think that Labor Day is really very much about gratitude. Gratitude to those who have and those who do today perform all of those labors, recognized and not so recognized. These are labors that support us and connect us and heal us and protect us. Labors that teach us and inform us and delight us and provide for us. But I think that the power of gratitude is so much more when we're conscious and aware of what there is to be grateful for. We have some idea, and when we understand that interconnectedness that's so essential to our lives, isn't it? And for me, that works a lot better when I slow down, because I can be going 100 miles a minute and forget about these things. So I got to slow down, I got to meditate, or at least start breathing and be conscious of my breathing, and then I become aware of the people who built this chapel, for example. I become aware of the labors that have contributed to my life. The food, our roadways, our utilities, our homes, our landscape, our entertainment, the services that we depend on, and on and on and on. It's an elaborate thought, and I think it's an elegant thought to be thinking like this. And it's one that can fill us up and serve to enhance our understanding and our connection with fellow human beings, and our connection with the human and the universal spirit that really bonds us all together. My perspective on work and what we do individually is also influenced by my study of unity and my study of Buddhism over the past 20 years or so. Most of us have sustained ourselves by working at a job of some kind and earning a paycheck. Maybe some of you got all your money inherited, but you still do work. I bet you still do work. You still volunteer work, for example. And your job may be something you love doing or you don't love so much. You may see yourself as serving humanity or not. People may admire you for your profession, or you may see your profession as being more ethical than a mafia hitman, but maybe not a whole lot. And does it matter? Of it does. Of course it does. In Buddhism, it's taught that the way to peace, wisdom, and nirvana is the Noble Eightfold Path. Anybody ever heard of the Noble Eightfold Path? Some of you have. And one of the essential steps on that path is called right livelihood. It's number 5. Livelihood is how we make a living. And right livelihood, it's a way of making a living that does no harm to others and does no harm to oneself either. It was about 500 years before Christ was born that the Buddha said this: a lay follower should not engage in 5 types of business. Business in weapons, business in human beings, business in meat, business in intoxicants, and business in poison. Life and ethics seemed more clear back then. A modern-day Buddhist, a Vietnamese Zen teacher, wrote, today, to practice life livelihood today, you have to find a way to earn your living without transgressing your ideals of love and compassion. The way you support yourself can be an expression of your deepest self, or it can be a source of suffering for you and others. He also said our vocation can nourish our understanding and compassion, or can erode them, and that we should be awake to the consequences, far and near, of the way that we earn our living. Our global economy today, wow, that complicates that precaution about do no harm to others, and even do no harm to ourselves. For example, you might have somebody who works in a department store that sells merchandise that was made with exploited labor. Or perhaps there's merchandise that was made in a way that harms the environment. Even if your particular job doesn't require harmful or unethical action, perhaps you're doing business with somebody who does. Some things you can't know, of course, but are you still responsible somehow? I'm not here to say you are or not, but it's food for thought, isn't it? Recently, I was asked to do a job, and it was with a company that designs and manufactures gambling machines in Reno, Nevada. Where's the redeeming quality in that? So what do you think? Did I take the job? How many people here think I took the job? 1. How many people here think I didn't take the job? Wow, wow. I did accept the work. Wow. I'll tell you why. Oh my. You're going to judge me, aren't you? Okay. It certainly was going to provide me some livelihood. And it took me to a location near where my grandchildren live, because they live in Utah. But just as important, I know that it is an opportunity to do good. It's also an opportunity for me to learn. I'm not exactly sure how that's all going to manifest, but I know it will, and I will be aware. That's one way to look at it. Most jobs present, I think, endless opportunities for spiritual practice. And we can be mindful of the tasks that we do, and we can be helpful and supportive of co-workers. We can practice compassion and right speech in our communication as we do our work, whether it's for money or volunteering. Sometimes jobs can be a real opportunity for spiritual practice. Clashing egos, buttons that are pushed. You might find yourself working for someone or with somebody who is just plain nasty. Anybody ever get that experience? Yeah. When do you stay? When do you go? Sometimes it's hard to know all of that. And yes, dealing with a difficult situation can make you stronger. And you can say, well, this is going to make me stronger. But at the same time, an emotionally toxic workplace, or volunteer place even, can poison your life. If it's draining you more than nourishing you, you got to consider a change. And if your inner voice is screaming at you to follow another path, by all means, listen to that voice. I know some in here have. Otherwise, appreciate the value of the work that you're doing and that you have right now, and the job you have right now. Now, most of us either do now, some of us, and some of you are retired, or have spent most of the waking part of our lives doing work. It's important to assess how our work affects our minds and our hearts. How can our work become meaningful? How can it support and not be a hindrance to our spiritual practice? How can it be a place to deepen our awareness and deepen our kindness? There is another modern Buddhist teacher, S.N. Goenka, who said, if the intention is to play a useful role in society in order to support oneself and to help others, then the work one does is right livelihood. We don't all have to be Mother Teresa, and we don't all have to be heart surgeons. The bottom line is this: the work that embodies love, devotion, and service is just as much an attitude as the specific actions that we are taking in that work. So perhaps today, the Buddhist idea of right livelihood may be approached as conscious livelihood, being conscious. In other words, regardless of the job that you have, or a lack of a job, we have to be aware of the implications and the consequences of what we do. If an individual consciously approaches one's labors as a spiritual practice with right intention, kind speech, right action, and these are some of the other Noble Eightfold Path, then the choices and the changes in your workplace are possible, and the choices and the changes in your own heart with each of us individually are possible. And then all of our labors become labors of love. Happy Labor Day.